Good afternoon, my dear friends. Welcome to another session of the online lecture series being organized by the Department of English, University of Gour. Today we have with us Professor Aparajita Hazra, Head, Department of English, Sidho Birsha University, and one of my old friends. Today, she has agreed to share her views about the interface between gender and literature. So, before I hand over the reins of this program to Aparajita Hazra, I would like to set certain matters straight. Today, Dr. Soumipendra Banerjee, one of our departmental colleagues, is also with us. And today he will act as a moderator. All the questions will be sent to the chat box, and Soumipendra Banerjee will choose the questions because there may be more than the number of questions that can be answered within the time frame. So Soumipendra will choose the questions and read them out. So no questions will be asked by the students. And three things you must know. One, to switch off your cameras. Two, to mute your microphone. And three, to stop sharing your screen. Or else it will be very difficult for us to run the program smoothly. So without further ado, let us listen to Aparajita Hazra.
Yeah, should I start, Amit?
Yes.
Great. So, good afternoon, everybody, and just hoping, keeping my fingers crossed that I can travel up to the end of this PowerPoint presentation without the internet backing off on me. It just did a little bit earlier, so it scared me out of my wits because I just noticed that I was offline, and then suddenly I had to bring in another internet connection by hotspot. So just hoping for the best. These are the collateral damages, I guess, of digital life. Now, after that kind introduction that Amit has given, yes, he is a very good friend of mine. So when he asked me to deliver a lecture, there was no point. There was no question of saying no. He asked me to give an overview of feminism, and he asked me to, zero in upon Simone de Beauvoir a little bit. So, since how much time do I have, Amit? Do I have 1 hour?
Usually, the lecture is of 1 hour duration, but you can actually extend it if you so wish by a few minutes more, and then there will be an interactive session as well.
Great. So I'll try to finish within 1 hour, hoping for the best. So let's start then. Now, feminism, while talking about feminism, I would start by saying that it's a very dicey term, a very tricky term, because it's a term that people try to understand, but I'm not really very sure about how many people actually have understood the entire purport of this term in the true sense of the term. That's why I keep saying that this is an often overrated word, often underrated word, often misunderstood word, and often, sad to say, but true, vilified word. Now, even women like Virginia Woolf were not very happy with the term feminism. We'll come to that later. Now, Margaret Walters, in her book Feminism, a very short introduction, traces the history of the opposition to the term feminism. So that also becomes a part of very important history. Not only do we need to understand the history of feminism, but we also need to know the history of the opposition to feminism. So to understand the entire magnitude of the fight that has been going on so far. An entire first chapter is dedicated to that history. Now, one book that I really like to read about feminism, apart from the scores of books that are there on the shelf. So this one is by Chris Whedon, Feminist Practice and Post-Structuralist Theory. Now, this came out in 1987, as you can see. Chris Whedon defines feminism in a kind of way that I feel is kind of comprehensive. Now, I'll tell you why. I'm quoting, feminism is a politics. It is a politics directed at changing existing power relations between women and men in society. These power relation structure all areas of life, the family, education, welfare, the worlds of work and politics, culture and leisure. They determine who does what and for whom, what we are and what we might become. So being and becoming, we all know about what Judith Butler talked about when she was talking about performativity. Now, what we are and what we might become. Now, I have now picked out certain words in the same definition that I want you, by you I mean my students, because the teachers are already familiar with all this, I guess. The students, I would like you to concentrate on the words that I have highlighted in green. Feminism is a politics. It is a politics directed at changing existing power relations. When we talk about power, a whole lot of, and a whole oeuvre of discussion and discourse opens up. Between women and men in society, these power relations structure all areas of life. It's kind of like ubiquitous. The family, education, welfare, the worlds of work and politics, culture and leisure, they determine who does what and for whom, what we are and what we might think, what we might become. Now, the main takeaway points from this then is reaction and resistance to patriarchy, ubiquity, the point that I was highlighting just now, engages almost all aspects, sorry about the spelling, I've forgotten one L, all aspects or facets of life. And the other word is power structure. Politics, changing existing power relations, all areas of life, family, education, welfare, the worlds of work and politics, culture and leisure, what we might become. This omnipresence of patriarchy then makes it difficult to figure out where to begin the resistance of patriarchy. You need to have a starting point, but if it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, then where do you begin from? That itself is a point of debate. Where did it all begin and when? So now, tracing our steps back, we need to understand when and where we began to be feministic, so to speak. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary is one of our favorite texts whenever it comes to definition, so we cannot do without it. This time, the Oxford Dictionary does come up with a nice definition, and that's why I'm quoting it. It gives you a clue about the spatial and temporal coordinates about where to start the discussion of feminism from. This is what it says. The advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of, liberal feminism has equal rights for men and women as its major concern. The issue of rights for women first became prominent during the... Right. So what we were saying is, picking up the threads once again, that this omnipresence of patriarchy makes it a little difficult to figure out where do we start the discussion or where do we start the resistance to our patriarchy. Now, where did it all begin and when? And yes, I was in the Oxford English Dictionary thing. The issue of rights for women first became prominent during the French and American revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, in Britain, it was not until the emergence of the suffragette movement in the late 19th century that there was a significant political change. This is why I said that it gives you a temporal and spatial, reconnaissance of where and when it began. So it was with the French Revolution and the American Revolutions in the late 18th century. In Britain, in the late 19th century, that was a significant political change. A second wave of feminism rose in the 1960s. We know that the first wave began towards the end of the... a second wave of feminism rose in the 1960s with an emphasis on unity and sisterhood. Seminal figures included Betty Friedan, Germaine Greer, and of course, I would also include over here Simone de Beauvoir. A third wave was identified in the late 1980s and 1990s as a reaction against the perceived lack of focus on class and race and other movements. This is why I like this definition a little bit, because it gives you a kind of, it places you it places feminism, gives you the location. French and American revolutions, late 18th century, late 19th century, Britain, and second wave of feminism in 1960s, unity and sisterhood were the main things. A third wave identified in the 1980s and 1990s focused on class race issues in earlier movements. Now, what are the points then that we need to concentrate on? Advocacy of equality of the sexes. I'm using the word sexes, not gender. Equal political rights, equal social rights, equal economic rights. It first then began during the French Revolution, and the dates we know, It began during the, just give me a moment, began during the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Then, if we really look at the movements of feminism, we understand that there are a few traits of feminism that are quite evident. Number one is, it is a post-enlightenment thing. That is, it came into circulation more than ever. It began much earlier. Like I'll be showing it to you. Even before the first wave of feminism, we had something called Proto Feminism, and it dates back a long way back. Now, post-enlightenment, by which I mean that it came after the surging forward of the idea of reason. Occident-centric, it is mainly Europe and America-centric. Activism of Savitribai Phule or Tarabai Shinde or Pandita Ramabai, the people who were actually doing feminist anti-patriarchal activities here in our India, for instance, these are not really taken into account when we talk about this Occident-centric feminism that we normally know as feministic movements. White woman-centric, which though later on it started changing. From the late 18th century right up to the 1980s and 1990s, it was like that. It was more bourgeois than anything else. After that, a more race and class conscious feminism came into circulation. Now, what are we talking against? What is feminism all about? What is the resistance against? What is patriarchy? Patriarchy also needs to define, because we need to know what exactly it is that we are going against in order to make the movement even more successful and fruitful. Chris Whedon again, the term patriarchal refers to power relations in which women's interests are subordinated to the interests of men. These power relations take many forms, from the sexual division of labor and the social organization of procreation to the internalized, this is important, even Simone de Beauvoir will, stress on the futile fertility, something that she called futile fertility, to the internalized norms of femininity by which we live. Patriarchal power rests on the social meanings given to biological sexual difference. In patriarchal discourse, the nature and social role of women are defined in relation to a norm which is male. This finds its clearest expression in the generic use of the term man and he to encompass all humankind. Whenever we talk about what human beings do, it is still the norm in our even in this age to say, this is good for man. He would want to do this. We still unconsciously elude the pronominal she, though now we are consciously trying to butt in with the pronominals of she and her in places where they were never to be heard. Femininity, normativity, these then are some tricky words that we need to understand. Now, a quick coup d'oeil of the history of feminism would tell us that feminism, even before the movements, a long way back, even in the days of Plato, the thoughts that would point or direct towards equality were making the circulation. Plato in Republic once said in his book 5, are dogs divided into he's and she's? Or do they both share equally in hunting and keeping watch and in the other duties of dogs? Or do we entrust to the males the entire and exclusive care of the flocks? while we leave the females at home under the idea that the bearing and suckling their puppies is labor enough for them. So what he was actually trying to say, the Republic states that women in Plato's ideal state should work alongside men, receive equal education, and share equally in all aspects of the state. The sole exception involved women working in capacities which required less physical strength. But sadly, Aristotle did not share this view. Aristotle said something quite different. He said that females were botched up males. They started out trying to be males, but then something went wrong and they became a botched up males. We'll come to that later when we talk about Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir points out that the first time we see a woman take up her pen in defense of her sex was when Christine de Pizan wrote Epithure or d'Amour, Epistle to the God of Love, and the Book of the City of Ladies at the turn of the 15th century. Catherine of Aragon, the first official female ambassador in European history, argued that women had a right to an education and encouraged and popularized education for women in England during her time as Henry VIII's wife. You know that she had a very unfortunate kind of life, and then it didn't really end well with her. Roger Ascham educated Elizabeth I, who read Latin and Greek and wrote occasional poems, such as On Monsieur's Departure, that are still anthologized. Queen Elizabeth I was described as having talent without a woman's weakness, industry with a man's perseverance, and the body of a weak and feeble woman, but with the heart and stomach of a king. Here again, these words could, raise our hackles, because when you talk about without a woman's weakness, you are actually taking it for granted that women are supposed to be weak. Industry with a man's perseverance, you're again taking for granted that man's perseverance is a man's domain. With the heart and stomach of a king, that again does the same thing. This reminds me that when Simone de Beauvoir was very young, she was very good in studies, So when she was very young, her father used to be very proud of her, saying she thinks and studies, she thinks and ratiocinates like a man. There again, you're putting man in the position of a rational being, where women are normally supposed not to be rational creatures, but in her case, it was a marvel that she was as rational as a man. We'll come to that later. A woman named Margarita, living during the Renaissance, learned to read and write at the age of about 30. So she began at the age of about 30, quite late. So there would be no mediator for the letters, but the reason is quite amusing. She learned to study so that there would be no mediator for the letters exchanged between her and her husband. Although Margarita did divide the gender roles, she became literate not in order to become a more enlightened person, but because she wanted to be a better wife by gaining the ability to communicate with her husband directly. But then it was something. The 17th century saw the development of many nonconformist sects, such as the Quakers, which allowed more freedom of expression to women than the established religions. Excuse me. Among the Arab women in the 18th century, female infanticide was prohibited alongside recognizing women's full personhood. The dowry, previously regarded as a bride price paid to the father, became a nuptial gift retained by the wife as part of her personal property. So the main word here is retained by the wife. It was not given to them. Under Islamic law, marriage was no longer viewed as a status, but rather as a contract in which the women's consent was imperative. Women were given inheritance rights too in a patriarchal society that had previously restricted inheritance to male relatives. Now, the first wave feminism, I'm just, skimming through these because this is not actually what I want to zero in upon. But since if we talk about the history of feminism, these things cannot be done without. So naturally, I'm just skimming through this as quickly as possible. I'll just give you the main points over here. When the 19th century and the early 20th century, mainly the UK and the US, the promotion of equal rights in marriage, parenting, property rights, gaining political power, women's sexual, reproductive, economic rights. Fallout, women's suffrage started in Britain, Australasian colonies at the end of the 19th century. The self-governing colonies of New Zealand granted women the right to vote in 1893. South Australia began female suffrage in 1895. Australia granted female suffrage in 1902. In 1918, the Representation of the People's Act was passed, granting the vote to women over the age of 30. In 1928, this was extended to all women over 21. These were the main people, the women who were fighting it out during the first wave feminism. The second wave feminism, the focus was suffragette movement, the reform of family laws, abolish the marital exemption in rape laws, issues of equality other than suffrage, and the ending of such gender-based discrimination, encouraging women to understand aspects of their personal lives as deeply politicized. No, because we remember Carol Hanish's The Personal is Political, as reflecting sexist power structures as women's cultural and political inequalities are inextricably linked. Fallout, women were given the right to vote by the women's suffrage. And who were the ones? Simone de Beauvoir, Carol Hanish, Betty Friedan, whose feminine mystique was one of the trigger factors here. Third wave feminism, focus was issues of sexuality, challenging female heterosexuality, because by now Judith Butler and the people had come up with gay rights and lesbian rights, and they were talking about how gender is a construct that is socially made, how it is performative, how we do not belong to gender, how we do gender, we perform gender. Celebrating sexuality as a means of female empowerment, challenging essentialist definitions of femininity, which they argue overemphasize the experiences of upper middle class white women, consideration of race-related subjectivities, difference feminism, inherent debate about the differences of the sexes, who believe there are important differences, versus those who believe that there are no inherent differences, because these will come into use when we talk about écriture feminine and things like that. Global issues like rape, incest, prostitution, glass ceiling practices, this was not heard of earlier, homophobia, classism, and colonization. Gloria Anzaldúa, Sheila Sandoval, Cherry Moraga, Audre Lorde, Maxine, these were the people who were in the forefront. Now, we cannot really talk about all the ladies who talked about feminism, so these are some of my favorites. Mary Wollstonecraft, Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, and Betty Friedan. Now, since Amit, my very good friend, he asked me to concentrate on Simone de Beauvoir, I'll concentrate more on her than the other people, though I don't think I'll be able to leave them out completely, because no discussion on feminism can be complete without these women. They were seminal. But even earlier in 1589, a full-fledged polemic discussing the rights of women and elevating them came out. It was written by some Jane Anger. 1589 was the date. Protection was woman was the name of the polemic. Polemic is a short writing where you argue out something against the prevalent convention. Jane Anger over here brings forth a very nice and interesting argument. She says, we all say that Eve is inferior to Adam because Eve is made out of the ribs and bones of Adam. But she says that Eve is better and purer because Adam was made out of dust, but Eve was made out of flesh and bone. So she was even purer and she was one notch higher already when she was born. But texts like these were drawing imagery from the Bible. So Eve, Adam, these are all biblical references. This being a theocentric age, all social and political aspects were theocentric, no wonder. In the argument underlying those aspects, the Bible too gave examples of women like Virgin Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, so she was elevated to a position. Mary Magdalene, who came and confessed her sins to Jesus, and so she was also one of the exemplary characters of exemplary womanhood. So these were characters again from the Bible. But once the Enlightenment set in and the theocentric world gave way to a more rational, more rationality-centric world where divinity gave way to rationality, there was a paradigm shift. Now, the American Revolution was there from 1765 to 1783, the French Revolution, 1789. We all know about the storming of the Bastille. The documents that came out of these two revolutions are important because they set the tone, they set the mood for discussion about feminism. What were those documents that we are talking about? The United States Declaration of Independence is one of the very, very important documents that we are going to take up a little later. Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. These subverted the earlier rubric of divinely ordaining hierarchical social structure. So all men are equal. This ideology started making the rounds from this time. This brought forth man's place in society based on rationality, not upon divinity. Now, I'm just picking out a few lines from the Declaration of Independence, the lines that will suit my purpose. We hold these truths to be self-evident. This is a very important word. These truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And all these rights are equally to be enjoyed by all men. I would here like to revert back to a slide where I said that we generically use the term men to, specify humanity. All men, and this fact that they will enjoy these rights is self-evident. Self-evident, why? Because if you think with your common sense, then it's only evident that everybody is entitled to these rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So I've again highlighted these by color. Created equal, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The same excerpt. This reminds us of what Whedon says, something that I was referring to just now. This patriarchy finds its clearest expression in the generic use of the term man and he to encompass all of humankind. Now, what happened after this? The word self-evident then means the exercise of rationality and common sense. So the paradigm shift that I was talking about from divinity to rationality and common sense was done not by any divine intervention. Now here I would like to edge in Mary Wollstonecraft a little bit. She steps in here. We all know about her treatise, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. It attempts to place women on the same platform of rationality and human rights as men are. So instead of Jane Anger, how she talked about women from the Bible, here Mary Wollstonecraft is not talking about divinity or the Bible any longer. She's talking pure, simple sense. She's just talking about rationality. She says, why not place women on the same platform of rationality and human rights as men are? This is what ushered in the modern discourse. I always like to call it the modern discourse of femininity. In Vindication, what does she say? Women are human beings, therefore as rational as man is, therefore as much a claimant to the rights mentioned in the Declaration as men are. Now, if you call women irrational, if anybody calls women irrational, or rather unrational, because I'm trying to talk about rationality and non-rationality in case of women, or unrational, would therefore be a subversion of the very common sense that men stand for. Here I would like the students to understand the line of her argument. She tried to say that if men are supposed to be rational creatures, so it is self-evident to them that the rights of life, liberty, and they are enjoyable to them, then the same rationality and the same common sense would vouch for the fact that women as human beings are as rational as man is. So the same rights should be applicable to women as much as to men. If women sometimes appear to be rather irrational, she also mentions this, or ignorant or slack, that is not because they are inherently stupid, but because of the lack of kind of education that is given to men. Here, if you really read about the life of Mary Wollstonecraft, you'll see that they had a lot of siblings. There were a lot of children in the family, and it was a kind of like middle class family. There was not much money to go around. So their father decided that only one of the children could be educated properly. Now, there were a lot of girls, and there was one boy, Edward. And who would be chosen for the right of education but the boy? So, Wollstonecraft never really got any formal education. but she was kind of like, autodidactic. She was an autodidact. She taught herself. She taught herself to study. The lack of the kind of education that is given to men, and the disdain with which the exercise of rationality in women is looked down upon as unfeminine. So it's like, if women talk in a rational way, people would look down upon her, and they would say that you are lacking your feminine qualities, not because of any inherent lack of rationality. Now, this was in 1792, Vindication of the Rights of Women. So women to be taken as rational subjects, right to education, and this would need an overhauling of the idiosyncrasy of the entire society. Now, even after so many years, 1792 was when Mary Wollstonecraft was talking about equality on the basis of rationality, not to be, not to look down on women who talk in rational ways. This is just a digression, but it's just interesting to mention. The other day, I was just watching a film on Netflix. I think, if I remember correctly, it was Breaking In, some sort of a film of that sort. Now, it is all about 4 men breaking into a house where only a mother with her 2 children were there. And this mother and her 2 children, one of the children is a boy and the other is a girl. Now, very predictably, when they enter this big house, this big house is rigged up with a lot of electrical gadgets, a lot of cameras and a lot of electrical gadgets. Very predictably, the girl goes sashaying around doing this and that in the kitchen, and the boy sits in that power control room, and he is fiddling around with the camera and the gadgets. So I was immediately thinking that so many years later, so many ages later, we still talk about rationality in terms of man, and we still talk about non-rationality in terms of women. That is why, the journey of feminism is far, far from over. So this would need an overhauling of the idiosyncrasy of the entire society, not just the man or the woman. Because the society in general, including both men as well as women, were educated in a great degree by the opinions and manners of the society. You just can't educate one man or one woman. Society in general, all men and all women need to be educated that way. But all that has to be changed in order to bring about a revolution in the female manners. This again, when you talk about this word, female manners, what do you actually mean by female manners? That is the question. This again posits us against some very uncomfortable questions. What is meant by female manners? What is feminine? Who gets to decide that? Simone de Beauvoir wrote that no biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society, and one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, the very important and very, very famous quotation. This idea was picked up in 1959 by Canadian-American sociologist Erving Goffman, who argued that women are socially conditioned to present themselves as precious, ornamental, fragile, uninstructed in and ill-suited for anything requiring muscular exertion, and to project shyness, reserve, and a display of frailty, fear, and incompetence. I got this quotation, I got this mentioned. This was not from Erving Goffman's book, but I got Erving Goffman mentioned in Catherine A. Ziegler's book, Formidable Femininity. So, precious, ornamental, fragile, uninstructed in, I really am tempted to talk about the gaze theory, the male gaze and the female gaze over here, but Amit is going to kill me if I digress into more and more longer and longer issues, so I'm going to stick to the point now. But it is all about the panopticon gaze. Laura Mulvey talked about it. Even before that, Foucault talked about it, how the gaze is always, in the very Lacanian sense, it's always chasing us. We are always under the gaze. And John Bergman once very nicely put it. Women sometimes are, what should I say? They fall a prey to looking at being looked at. what he meant to say is that women dress up, women do themselves up in a way which they know that will please men. That is another discourse altogether, so I'm not going to go into that. In 1990, by American author Judith Butler, in her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, a very favorite book of mine, theorized that gender is not fixed or inherent, but is rather a socially defined set of practices and traits that have over time grown to become labeled as feminine or masculine. Like I was saying earlier, that Butler says that we do not belong to gender, or gender doesn't belong to us. We do gender. We kind of like perform gender. Chris Whedon again, to say that patriarchal relations are structural is to suggest that they exist in the institutions and social practices of a society and cannot be explained by the intentions, good or bad, of individual women or men. This is what I was talking about a little earlier. Individual women and men are not going to take it very far, but society in general has to be educated. They have to change their social practices, because this is a complete vicious cycle. I'll just go into one short digression, but I can't, resist mentioning this. I used to be the director of the Center of Women's Studies in our university. Now, when we began this Center of Women's Studies, I inaugurated the center with a huge fanfare, and we had a lot of talks about feminism. We had a lot of talks about equality, equity. A lot of terms were, shuffled here and there. And after that, everybody clapped. And when I was driving out of my university, one of the very high officials of university looked at me and said, "Madam, খুব ভালো তো হলো আজকে, কিন্তু একটা কথা বলুন তো, ছেলেরা আর মেয়েরা কি সমান হয়?" So, it burst my balloon of happiness. I was feeling that, yes, we are doing something in society. The moment that man said that, I knew that I was back to square one and we had to start from scratch. So, educating individual men and women is not enough. The entire society has to be educated, and entire society has to be instructed. Now, here I would be tempted to talk about the ecological systems theory of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, because this is why I'm saying that the entire society is very, very interconnected. We cannot just do with educating one individual woman or one individual man. That's not going to help, because they are part of a bigger circle which needs to be taken care of. This is the pictorial depiction of Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. You see that the individual is only at the core over here, and that individual has a lot of systems to negotiate with, like the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, the macrosystem. So all of that is here. The individual, is either a woman or a man or a child or whoever it is. Now the macrosystem is made up of your nearest, the people who are nearest you, that is your family, or when you're going to university, your university friends and peers. This microsystem again is working in a mesosystem, and this mesosystem again, the microsystem and the mesosystem, they react with each other in order to make the exosystem. So what exactly are these systems? Very quickly. Microsystem means the institutions, including family, school, religious institutions, neighborhood, peers, para, mohalla, all these things. Now, mesosystem, interconnections between the microsystems, like between the family and the teachers. Exosystem is interconnections between the microsystems. All these microsystems are interconnected to each other. Like your family, your religious institutions, your school, neighborhood, peers are all connected. So much so that a child's experience at home may be influenced by the parents' influence at work. Macrosystem describes the overarching culture that influences the developing child, as well as the microsystems and the mesosystems. Cultural contexts can differ based on geographic location, socio-economic status, poverty, ethnicity. Macrosystems evolve across time and from generation to generation. Chronosystem consists of the pattern of environmental events and transitions over the life course. This is not This is just a side point. So, an example of changing social historical circumstances is the increase in opportunities for women to pursue a career during the last 30 years. So, all these systems are interlinked so much so that the individual who is quietly tucked away right in the middle of it can do nothing unless the entire system moves. It's like shifting your gears while you're driving. So the first gear, unless you start with the first gear, you cannot jump to the fifth gear all of a sudden. So it's like that. This entire system works in an interconnected way. If we really look deeper, we will see that the social institutions which we enter as individuals, for example, the family, schools, colleges, teenage fashion, or even pop culture, the church and the worlds of work and leisure pre-exist us. By that, what I mean to say is that when we come into this world, we are already coming into a world which is ready with its own set of ideologies and taboos and beliefs, and it pre-exists us. We are only born into it. We just take over the prevalent ideas. It's very easy to fall into the groove. So we just take over the prevalent ideas of patriarchy instructed normativity as glibly as a fish takes to water. It only takes gumption to fight against it, to think out your own ideas and implement them. It's very easy to conform. Right. So Simone, Lucy, Ernestine, Marie, Bertrand de Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir for us, 1908 to 1986 were her dates. Her father was Georges Bertrand de Beauvoir, was a legal secretary who once aspired to be an actor. Her mother was a devout Catholic, was a banker's daughter, and her sister Helene, 2 years younger than Simone. Now, if I really ask you who was Simone de Beauvoir, we only know her as the feminist, but she did have a lot of other credits to her, to herself, to her name. She was a novelist. She was a philosopher. She talked about feminist existentialism, which was very, very influenced by Sartre, and she herself was so influenced by Sartre that she had to fight for. She had to do quite a lot in order to come out of his shadow. Political activist, travel writer, feminist. Despite her contributions to the feminist movement, especially the French women's liberation movement, her beliefs in women's economic independence and equal education, de Beauvoir was initially reluctant to call herself a feminist. This term sometimes probably put people off, but so they don't want to label themselves to be a feminist. Like Virginia Woolf also initially had a kind of standoffish attitude towards it. However, after observing the resurgence of the feminist movement in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, de Beauvoir stated that she no longer believed the socialist revolution to be enough to bring about women's liberation. Now she talked about herself as a feminist. She publicly declared herself as a feminist in 1972 in an interview with Le Nouvel Observateur. Triggered off the second wave of feminist movement, Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, the pace, a dialogue with Simone de Beauvoir in Betty Friedan's It Changed My Life, Writings on the Women's Movement. Interestingly, in an interview with Betty Friedan, Beauvoir said, "No, we don't believe that any woman should have this choice. No woman should be authorized to stay at home, to bring up her children. Society should be totally different." So the society in general, they always authorize the woman to stay at home, but this should not be. The woman should have her own life wound around her own little finger. There should not be men telling her what to do. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice precisely because if there is a choice, too many women will make that one. It is a way of forcing women in a certain direction. Like saying you can be a good woman and stay at home, or you can be a not so good one and you can pursue your career. So that even today, when women like us pursue our career, we try to do it after doing all the household work, after looking after our children, after doing all that is expected out of us as women. Because we are always, it's drilled, it's ingrained in our psyche which has been conditioned by years of patriarchy, that this is what you're actually meant for. If you're stepping out of those bounds, then you're actually doing something for your own enjoyment, and you should be guilty about that. So we are trying to get out of that slowly, little by little. Now, from 1929, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre were what they call soul partners. They had a very unique kind of relationship. They were soul partners. They never really married, and they had multiple partners on their own. Beauvoir had a number of partners while so until Sartre's death in 1980. This again, gives us this photograph, gives me kind of like, it always makes me think, why did the photograph stand on this side? So that he could get a closer view of Sartre and a farther off view of Beauvoir, as if she's kind of like behind him. Okay, let's not read too much. Virginia Woolf once talked of the empty spaces of invisibility that women are often choked by. In a room of one's own, she invented Judith. That was a very interesting thing, those of you children who have studied the room of one's own. She invented a character called Judith Shakespeare, the equally talented sister of Shakespeare, William Shakespeare. Give me a second, there's an WhatsApp message I need to... Yeah. So, sister of Shakespeare, who is relegated to the ignominy of anonymity just because she is a woman. As the sole partner of the celebrated Jean-Paul Sartre, I often feel that de Beauvoir was gradually being enveloped by the second fiddle syndrome, being overshadowed. A scholar lecturing with de Beauvoir at Harvard once questioned why every question asked about Sartre by what was famed to be the distinguished Harvard audience, why every question asked by them to Sartre was concerned about his work, while every question asked to Beauvoir concerned her personal life. Now, this reminds me of this, though is a digression, it will give you another example of the second, what I call the second fiddle syndrome. This reminds one of the overshadowing that happened with the famous Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. We all know that she was a very, very talented artist, a very talented painter. Her husband was the famous muralist Diego Rivera. Now, to my chagrin, I found out this newspaper report from 1933, which came out with an article to introduce Kahlo. All it could think of to say while describing Frida Kahlo and all her talent was that wife of master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art. This is so pejorative. I mean, first of all, they introduce Frida Kahlo as if she has no other identity but being the wife of master mural painter Diego Rivera. And then when he is the master mural painter, she is just a dabbler. So this is how you see that women have always been in the shadow zone, something that I was just now talking about, the empty spaces of invisibility that Virginia Woolf talks about. And she talks about how a woman should have a room of her own and an earning of 500 pounds, so that she can write in peace. So, coming back, de Beauvoir often egged on this idea about herself also, saying that her writings were just elaborations of Sartre's theories. Formal education, this is a little bit about Beauvoir to show you that she was really, really very educated, and she was not like an autodidact like Mary Wollstonecraft, but she did have a formal education. She was the 9th woman to earn a degree from Sorbonne, first woman to qualify the prestigious competitive exam of the Agrégation in philosophy after unofficially doing a course in École Normale Supérieure. This was a kind of exam that they had to sit for in order to become the teachers. Incidentally, Sartre stood first by a hairbreadth and de Beauvoir stood second. Right. So Deirdre Baer, in her 1990 biography titled Simone de Beauvoir, a biography, mentions how de Beauvoir's father used to boast, Simone thinks like a man, as if thinking like a man, rational thinking is only the prerogative of a man. So if a woman thinks rationally, she has to be like a man, not like a woman. Nobody can say Simone thinks like a woman. Between 1929 and 1943, de Beauvoir worked as a school teacher. Post 1943, she started earning only with her writings. She started writing professionally. Her works, I already mentioned that she started out as a novelist. So she started with 1943. She came to stay. This was again a kind of autobiographical. I wouldn't say autobiographical, but it pivots on the character she was linked with. The Mandarins again is a novel, 1954. The Second Sex, this is the novel. This is the book that we are concerned with, 1949. The work that triggered the second wave of feminism. The chapters of The Second Sex were originally published in Les Temps Modernes in June 1949. The second volume came a few months after the first in France. Now, it was quickly published in America. You know, this was in French. Now, I always have this chagrin. I always have this regret that I don't know French. So I always have to read whatever I read in translation. And the politics of translation takes away a lot from the original work. This is something that I always believe. But it was quickly published in America due to the quick translation by Howard Parsley, as prompted by Blanche Knopf, the wife of publisher Alfred A. Knopf. But Parsley, being a professor of biology at Smith College, had only a basic familiarity with the French language and a minimal understanding of philosophy. Thus, much of de Beauvoir's work was mistranslated or inappropriately cut, distorting her extended message. But for years, Knopf, the person, Alfred A. Knopf, who was a publisher, he prevented the introduction of a more accurate retranslation of de Beauvoir's work, declining all proposal despite the efforts of existentialist scholars. Only in 2009 was there a second translation to mark the 60th anniversary. Constance Baudet and Sheila Malovany, they produced this original work. Okay. Now the main points. Existentialist feminism, the sex-gender distinction, turns Sartre's statement that existence precedes essence into a feminist one. One is not born, but becomes a woman. Woman, the other, as compared to man, the fundamental source of woman's oppression is its femininity, by its we mean femininities, historical and social construction of the quintessential other. Beauvoir pointed out, sorry for the abbreviation, Beauvoir pointed out that man is kind of like the norm. It's normative. Woman is a deviation or corruption of man, corrupt version of man. So she is the second sex. Aristotle, female by virtue of a certain lack of qualities. Aristotle, like I was telling you while I was talking about Plato, that Aristotle thought of women like a botched man. St. Thomas referred to woman as imperfect man and the incidental being. Differences manifest in science, literature, everyday experiences of life. This is what Aristotle said. Woman is literally a monster, a failed and botched male who is only born female due to an excess of moisture and of coldness during the process of conception. Come on. So what Beauvoir spoke against is that women are naturally different from man. It's not true. An argument that has been in use for ages to justify the differentiation between man and woman's inferior position. De Beauvoir maintains that both men and women are basically made from the same one-celled organism, called a cell, which lives and procreates. Freud's psychosexual view that women are a deviation from the male because, or a lacked, damaged form of a male who is born because of the lack of the male organ, the lack of the penis. De Beauvoir contested the Freudian view that all activities are determined by the psychosexual drives, impulses, and libidos, a view that negates the role of choice for intent, or the social values and norms that shape the personality of a human being. Engels' view that women are treated as inferior because of the division of labor, where men emerge as breadwinners. Now, Beauvoir questioned the very reason for the genesis and existence of the division of labor. She says, why in the first place do you determine men as the breadwinners at all? In the chapter, Woman, Myth and Reality of the Second Sex, de Beauvoir argued that men had made women the other in society by application of a false aura of mystery around them. Later on, you'll find that even people like Judith Butler, people like Helen Zhu, people they will also talk about demythologizing women. She argued that men use this as an excuse not to understand women or their problems. When you say women are a mystery, we just don't understand what they say, you're actually undercutting the fact that they might have some rationality. And by saying that they do not understand women or their problems and not to help them, that is, the stereotyping was always done in societies by the group higher in the hierarchy to the group lower in the hierarchy. So it is always the group, the subaltern, if I may use that word, who is described as a mysterious person whom it's very difficult to understand by the person who's higher in the hierarchy. She wrote that a similar kind of oppression by hierarchy also happened in other categories of identity, such as race, class, religion, but she claimed that it was nowhere more true than with gender, in which men stereotyped women and used it as an excuse to organize society into a patriarchal structure. This reminds me of what we all know, Can the Subaltern Speak? She was talking about all kinds of subalternity, and there she said that if there is any kind of subalternity, the worst kind of subalternity where women are in the shadow is about women. They are no one knows how many times marginalized. According to de Beauvoir, the othering of women happened because they were identified with reproduction, like women are the childbearers, and procreation right from the primitive ages. Reproduction is a repetitive process and is something that is prevalent in animals too. There's nothing huge in it. Women were associated with reproductive activities as if they are only good for that. Yet, human civilization has always valued progress through adventurous activities outside home, inventing new things for the sustenance of their kind and being more outgoing in gathering resources for their community, all of which are productive activities. And sadly, men are the ones associated with that. When we talk about the progress of civilization, we don't say, a lot of babies were created. That is civilization. We never say that. We always say the fire was invented, this was done, that was invented, men started inventing the wheel. Then one day, it comes down to invention and up to the invention of other things. Productivity is more valued. Reproductivity is a kind of thing that is just there. Just because you're an organism, you will reproduce. So what is so great in that? And women are connected with that, while men are connected with productivity. So Beauvoir blames what she called absurd fertility for being relegated to the reproduction for agency through an excessive control over her children. Freud talks about it later. Then Barbara Creed talks about it in the trope of the monstrous feminine. Yeah, Freud's fetishism talks about that a little bit. Barbara Creed writes a long essay on how the trope of the monstrous feminine is created. Julia Kristeva also talks about the abject, and at one point of time, after describing the abject, after giving you the images of the patina on top of the milk and all that, she also talks about how a mother becomes an abject as compared to the father. Well, that is a digression. I'm not going to go into that. According to Beauvoir, the only thing that can emancipate a woman out of this subservience is economic autonomy. This again brings us back to what Virginia Woolf was saying, the 50 pounds under your belt. So women's participation in productive workforce as fully or equally paid worker is very necessary. But the matter of regret is that even in the workplace, women often find themselves the second sex again in matters of payment, etc. Again, a small digression. Even today, if you really look around yourselves, when you are having a meeting in the university and there is some amount of technology involved, the authorities will first turn towards the men as if it is taken for granted that the women do not know how to handle technology. This is something that rankles in my mind, so I just shared with you. Right. So society needs to move towards a more egalitarian mindset where women and men will be regarded as equals, not as battling counterparts, but as equals who will unequivocally form a congregation. Discourse for women should be sustained. This effort caught pace around 1970s. Why I'm talking about a discourse for women to be sustained? Because you might be familiar with the writing of with the work of Michel Foucault, who wrote The Archaeology of Knowledge, and at one point of time he says that the formation of a discourse depends on basically three things. Number one, if in order to be a discourse, in order to turn into a discourse, a topic has to be it has to be considered sane, not insane. Like when Galileo was talking about the geocentric universe, people said you're insane, so they just shoved him into a room and incarcerated him. But today we call that sane. So the idea of sanity needs to be there. It cannot be a taboo. That is the second condition. And the third condition that Foucault delineates is that it has to have some kind of institutional ratification. So the discourse for women should be sustained. It has been initiated, but it has to be sustained. And it won't be sustained unless we stop talking, we stop considering some matters of the female part of the world as taboo. Like talking about female sexuality is still considered to be taboo, that needs to be climbed out of. It has to be institutionally ratified. By institution, I don't mean this university and that university. What I mean is that the institution of the institutions that society goes by, even in the institution, marriage is an institution, that kind. So unless it is done that way, a discourse for women will not really be sustained. It can be started, but it won't really. So gynocriticism is one way in which we try to sustain that. Hello?
Yes, he's saying we find in cyborg fictions the blurring of borderliness between
cyborg fiction. All right. Yeah.
Between the mind and the body, organic and organic, human and non-human. My question is, can we see the technological interventions in gender discourse as a future of feminism, or it's just an utopian counter discourse?
This question has, it's a very interesting question. Now, cyborgs is stepping into the post-humanistic department, because cyborg, the word itself comes from cybernetic, and it's a portmanteau word where you combine cybernetic and organism. So though the word organism is still there, can you still hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So though the word organism is still there, but I think that when you step into a post-human world, one of the greatest things about it is the gender divisions are probably, there is probably hope that the gender divisions, which are socially constructed, they might get blurred. And you're very right that they might get blurred. At least we can hope so. Yes.
So my question is regarding women's purpose in attaining their freedom. I mean, what should be their purpose to attain freedom or equality?
In attaining the freedom. All right.
Whether it is resistance, whether it's an act of resistance or a focus, on something else. Okay.
Let me begin at the beginning. Women's movements. To say that a women's movement is in order to bring about an act of resistance would be oversimplifying the entire issue. The act of resistance would not have been necessary had there been no resistance at all on the part of the patriarchal society against women in the first place, right? So had women been given the equal status right from the beginning, instead of productive sector, by dint of this misshapen argument that men are rational creatures and women are not, then women wouldn't have had to go into resistance at all. Patriarchy wouldn't have been formed at all. It would have been a society where egalitarianism rules the roost. But because that did not happen, unfortunately, for reasons which are umpteen, which are 1,001 reasons, you can go on counting and they won't, and it's been there from time immemorial. That's why, in order to bring about a kind of a society where women will be considered not just as a woman in the beginning, but as an individual who has the equal, besides having equal rights. First of all, you need to understand that a woman has equal abilities as well. I'm talking about the abilities of the intellectual faculty. That needs to be there right from the beginning. Saying that a woman is kind of like not rational is something that women have to fight against. So that, I think, is primarily what women are fighting for. And resistance is not the end. The resistance is not the destination. Resistance is just a process. Equal status is the destination. That is what women are asking for. That is what they are fighting for, actually. I hope that answers your question.